In 1914, the world plunged into a war unlike any before, a global conflict of trenches, gas, and death. At first, America stayed out, but by 1917, the nation joined the fight, forever changing its role on the world stage. World War I began in Europe in 1914, triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. The war divided Europe. Allied powers, France, Britain, Russia, later the US. Central powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire. It became a war of trenches, machine guns, mustard gas, and tanks. Massive casualties, millions dead. At first, the US remained neutral. By 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war. Why? Unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany. The sinking of the Lusitania, 1915, killed over 100 Americans. The Zimmermann telegram, a secret German message urging Mexico to attack the US, intercepted by the British. Economic ties. The US had loaned billions to the Allies. Idealism. Wilson claimed the US would fight to make the world safe for democracy. Once in the war, the US mobilized quickly. The Selective Service Act drafted over 2.8 million men. War industries boomed. Factories made weapons, uniforms, and vehicles. Women filled jobs left by soldiers. African Americans joined the war or migrated north for work, part of the Great Migration. The American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John Pershing, fought bravely in France. By late 1918, the tide turned. Germany faced internal revolution and military defeat. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, ending the war. Nearly 117,000 Americans died in World War I. The total death toll, over 16 million worldwide. After the war, Wilson proposed a peace plan, the 14 points, called for free trade, self-determination, no secret treaties, a new League of Nations to prevent future wars. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, punished Germany harshly: war guilt, reparations, loss of land. It created the League of Nations, but the US Senate rejected it. Americans feared entangling alliances. The US never joined the League, weakening its power. What did World War I change for America? Global power status. The US emerged as a leading economic and military power. Isolationism. Despite victory, America turned inward during the 1920s. Civil liberties. The Espionage and Sedition Acts restricted speech. German Americans faced discrimination. Veterans returned changed both physically and mentally. The Roaring Twenties began, a new cultural and economic boom. World War I marked a turning point. America was no longer just a land of pioneers and farmers. It was now a force in global politics. But peace was fragile, and just 20 years later, the world would plunge into an even deadlier war. Coming next, Part 11, The Roaring Twenties, Jazz, Change, and the American Dream. The 1920s, a decade of jazz, flappers, fast cars, and booming cities. America had survived the Great War and entered an age of wealth and wild change. But beneath the music and lights, cracks were forming. After World War I, America saw massive economic growth. The stock market soared. Mass production revolutionized industry. Henry Ford's Model T made cars affordable. Assembly lines cut costs and increased output. New consumer goods, radios, washing machines, refrigerators, advertising boomed, promoting modern lifestyles. Credit and installment plans let people buy more, even if they couldn't afford it upfront. America was changing fast. Urbanization. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than in rural areas. Flappers, young women who defied traditions, short skirts, bobbed hair, and public smoking. Jazz Age. Jazz exploded from New Orleans into every corner of America. Artists like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington led a musical revolution. Harlem Renaissance, a Black cultural movement centered in New York. Poets like Langston Hughes celebrated African American identity. Cinema. Hollywood boomed with silent films and stars like Charlie Chaplin. The first talkie, The Jazz Singer, debuted in 1927. The 18th Amendment, passed in 1919, started prohibition, banning alcohol nationwide, meant to reduce crime and improve society. Instead, bootlegging became common. Speakeasies, secret bars, flourished in cities. Organized crime rose. Al Capone ruled Chicago's underworld. By 1933, Prohibition was considered a failure and repealed with the 21st Amendment. Though modern culture thrived, traditional values fought back. The Red Scare, 1919 to 1920, fear of communism after the Russian Revolution. Thousands of suspected radicals arrested or deported. Immigration restrictions. Quota laws limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Asians were mostly barred altogether. Resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Not just anti-Black, but also anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic. At its peak, over 4 million members. Scopes Trial, 1925. A teacher, John Scopes, was tried for teaching evolution, reflected the clash between science and religion. The 19th Amendment, 1920, granted women the right to vote nationwide. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers. A new era of independent womanhood emerged, but true equality was still far off. Technology advances reshaped daily life. Radio connected the nation, bringing music, news, and sports. Airplanes began commercial flights. Skyscrapers redefined city skylines. Electrical power reached more homes, changing how Americans lived and worked. But all parties come to an end. By the decade's close, the stock market became dangerously overinflated. Many Americans lived on credit and debt. Farming struggled, and wealth inequality grew. In October 1929, the stock market would crash, plunging America into the worst economic crisis in its history. The Roaring '20s brought freedom, excitement, and transformation. But it also sowed the seeds of a great fall. In our next chapter, we dive into the Great Depression, a time of suffering, survival, and sweeping change. It was the greatest economic collapse in U.S. history. Banks failed, millions lost jobs, families went hungry, and a new president would rise to try to save a broken nation. This was the Great Depression. The stock market crash of October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, marked the start of the crisis. Over $14 billion was lost in a single day. Stock values plummeted. Bank runs began. People rushed to withdraw money. Thousands of banks collapsed in the following months. Businesses failed and the economy fell into freefall. But the crash didn't cause the depression alone. It exposed deep flaws in the economy. Several factors created the perfect storm. Overproduction. Factories and farms produced more than people could buy. Uneven wealth. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. Consumer debt. Americans had borrowed heavily to buy goods on credit. Bank failures. Weak regulation meant savings were unprotected. Global issues. World War I debts and tariffs, like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, reduced international trade.
The effects were devastating. Unemployment rose to 25%. 1 in 4 workers had no job. Shantytowns known as Hoovervilles sprang up across cities. Families lined up for bread and soup kitchens. Many farmers lost their land. Children dropped out of school to help support families. The Dust Bowl. In the Great Plains, drought and poor farming destroyed the land. Huge dust storms forced thousands to flee, especially from Oklahoma. President Herbert Hoover believed in limited government intervention. He encouraged businesses to voluntarily keep wages up. Many didn't. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation gave loans to banks and businesses, but too late. His image suffered. Homeless camps were called Hoovervilles. The Bonus Army protest in 1932, World War I veterans demanded early payment. Troops drove them out, further hurting Hoover's reputation. In the depths of despair, Americans looked for hope. Franklin D. Roosevelt, governor of New York, ran promising a New Deal. He won a landslide victory, defeating Hoover by over 7 million votes. RD's optimism inspired people. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Roosevelt launched the New Deal, a massive effort to recover the economy. Key programs included CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, gave jobs to young men to build parks and roads. WPA, Works Progress Administration, employed millions for public works. Social Security Act of 1935 provided pensions for the elderly and unemployment insurance. FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, protected bank deposits. SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, regulated the stock market. RD also used radio fireside chats to speak directly to the American people, building trust. The New Deal wasn't universally loved. Some said it went too far, expanding government power. Others said it didn't go far enough to help the poor. Still, the New Deal reshaped America. It expanded the role of the federal government. It laid the foundation for the modern welfare state. Most importantly, it restored hope. But despite all efforts, full recovery wouldn't come until World War II. The Great Depression tested America like never before, but through suffering came strength and a new understanding of the government's role in people's lives. In the next chapter, the world will once again be at war, and America will be called upon to lead.
A world on fire, tyranny rising in Europe and Asia, the United States, still healing from depression, would soon face its greatest challenge and emerge stronger than ever. In the 1930s, Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power. They blamed Jews and others for Germany's loss in World War I. Hitler rebuilt Germany's military, violating the Treaty of Versailles. Italy, Benito Mussolini established a fascist regime and invaded Ethiopia. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and China in 1937, seeking dominance in Asia. America stayed neutral, influenced by the pain of World War I, but it supported allies. The Lend-Lease Act in 1941 provided weapons and supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union. December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. Battleships and aircraft were destroyed. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan, and soon after on Germany and Italy. America had entered World War II. The entire nation mobilized, factories retooled,
Cars became tanks, radios became radar. Women entered the workforce. Rosie the Riveter symbolized female factory workers. War bonds and rationing supported the military. Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps, a tragic violation of civil rights. The economy boomed, ending the Great Depression. Europe, D-Day, June 6, 1944. Allied forces landed in Normandy, France, a turning point. American troops helped liberate Paris and pushed into Germany. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe, or VE Day. The Holocaust. U.S. soldiers discovered concentration camps, the horror of the Holocaust. Over 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Pacific. Fierce battles at Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Japanese forces fought to the death, refusing surrender. To end the war quickly and avoid massive U.S. casualties, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, August 6th, and Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945. Over 200,000 civilians were killed. On August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered. Victory over Japan, or VJ Day. The war was over, but the world had changed forever. The cost of World War II: over 400,000 American soldiers killed, 75 million deaths worldwide. But America emerged as a global superpower. Its economy was booming, its military was unmatched. It played a leading role in founding the United Nations in 1945. Back home, soldiers returned to a new era of prosperity, but tensions were rising, especially with the Soviet Union. World War II reshaped the world and America's place in it. From the ashes of global conflict, a new world order would rise, and a new war, colder and quieter, was just beginning.
The Second World War was over, but peace did not follow. The world split in two: freedom versus control, capitalism versus communism. The Cold War had begun. After World War II, the US and the Soviet Union emerged as the two global superpowers. Ideological conflict: US to capitalist democracy, USSR to communist dictatorship. Stalin's Soviet Union took control of Eastern Europe, setting up puppet communist governments. Churchill warned of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine. The US would support free peoples resisting communist expansion. This marked the start of containment, stopping the spread of communism. Marshall Plan, 1948. $13 billion in aid to rebuild Western Europe. It helped prevent communist influence by improving economies. Berlin Airlift, 1948 to 1949. The Soviets blocked access to West Berlin. The US and allies flew in food and supplies for 11 months, over 2 million tons delivered. The Soviets backed down. NATO and the Red Scare. NATO, 1949. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, military alliance of the US, Canada, and Western Europe. An attack on one was an attack on all. In response, the USSR created the Warsaw Pact. Red Scare in America. The fear of communist spies and influence at home. Senator McCary McCarthy accused hundreds of being communists, often without proof. The era of McCarthyism led to blacklists and ruined reputations. The Korean War. 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The US and United Nations sent troops to defend South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur led the US forces. China joined the war on North Korea's side. The war ended in a stalemate in 1953. The 38th parallel became the permanent dividing line. Over 36,000 American soldiers died.
Arms race and space race. The Cold War turned nuclear. 1949, the USSR exploded its first atomic bomb. The US responded with the hydrogen bomb, H-bomb. A terrifying arms race began. Space race. 1957, USSR launched Sputnik, the first satellite. 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. The US formed NASA and increased funding for science and education. The competition pushed the world into a new technological age. Life in Cold War America. Duck and cover drills in schools. Fallout shelters in backyards. Americans feared a nuclear war at any time. But the 1950s also saw prosperity. Suburbs grew, the middle class expanded. Television became central to American life. The baby boom continued. Still, underneath the surface, civil rights struggles and global tensions brewed. The Cold War reshaped every aspect of American life: politics, culture, and international power. And though no shots were fired between the superpowers, the world came closer than ever to nuclear disaster. The Cold War was just getting started.
The 1960s, a decade of dreams and divisions, marches in the streets, war in the jungle, rockets to the stars. America stood at a crossroads and changed forever. The fight for racial equality reached its peak in the 1960s. 1960, 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, began sit-ins at a segregated lunch counter. Freedom riders challenged segregation on interstate buses. Martin Luther King Jr. led peaceful protests and called for nonviolent resistance. Key events: 1963, March on Washington. Over 250,000 people gathered as MLK delivered his speech, "I Have a Dream." 1964, Civil Rights Act banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, or sex. 1965, Voting Rights Act outlawed literacy tests and other voter suppression tactics. But violence continued. 1963, bombing of a Birmingham church killed 4 young girls. 1968, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. John F. Kennedy and a new generation. John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, young, charismatic, and hopeful. Challenged Americans with bold ideas. Quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." End quote. Major initiatives. Created the Peace Corps to help developing nations. Promised to land a man on the moon before the decade ended. Faced the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, a standoff with the Soviet Union over nuclear missiles in Cuba. Brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Successfully negotiated a peaceful resolution. But in 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, shocking the world. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over. He declared a war on poverty and introduced the Great Society programs, Medicare and Medicaid for healthcare, civil rights legislation, education and housing initiatives. While these programs helped millions, Johnson's presidency was overshadowed by one thing: Vietnam. America entered Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. It became the most controversial war in U.S. history. Timeline: 1964. Gulf of Tonkin incident led to full-scale U.S. involvement. 500,000 American troops deployed. Guerrilla warfare, jungles, and unclear goals made victory impossible. Back home, protests erupted across college campuses. Soldiers returned to a divided nation. Television brought the horrors of war into American living rooms. By the end of the decade, Americans were disillusioned,
questioning government, authority, and war. Culture, counterculture, and change. The 1960s saw an explosion of youth rebellion and cultural revolution. The Beatles and rock and roll redefined music. Woodstock Festival, 1969, symbolized peace, love, and resistance. The hippie movement embraced free love, drugs, and anti-war protests. The decade also saw the women's liberation movement gaining strength, Cesar Chavez leading farm worker rights movements, growing environmental awareness. The moon landing. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon. The U.S. had won the space race. Armstrong's words echoed across the globe. Quote, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." End quote. The moon landing was a unifying moment in a decade of conflict and change. The 1960s redefined America. In music and marches, in war and wonder, a generation demanded to be heard, and the nation was never the same again. Coming up, Part 16, the 1970s, Watergate, oil crisis, and the search for identity.